Chapter 26, Section 5, War in the Pacific, 1942 to 1945. The Americans led the Allied forces in the Pacific and did most of the fighting. When they went on the offensive, they chose a strategy of liberating Japanese-held islands in the Pacific and using them as stepping stones. Each captured island served as a base for assaults on other islands as the Allied forces moved closer to Japan. One of the keys to Allied success in the Pacific was the use of secret codes. The United States trained a special group of Navajo Indian code talkers for this task. Because Navajo is not a written language and is understood by very few people, it made an excellent basis for a code to transmit vital information. The Navajo code talkers played a key role in the Pacific campaign. The Japanese offensive ends at the Battle of Midway. Before the Allies could go on the offensive, they had to stop Japanese expansion. They achieved this goal at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. The Americans intercepted a Japanese message telling of plans for a major offensive. They figured out that the target was the U.S. base at Midway, a pair of islands about 1,200 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. With this knowledge, the Navy sat in wait for the Japanese fleet. At Midway, Japanese naval strategists hoped to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which had been their plan since Doolittle's raid on Tokyo. Instead, the U.S. Navy won a resounding victory. American planes from Midway and from 3 aircraft carriers demolished the enemy force, destroying all 4 Japanese carriers, a cruiser, and about 300 aircraft. Japan never recovered from the loss of the carriers and so many experienced pilots. The Battle of Midway was Japan's last offensive action. From then on, Japan would focus on defense. Liberating the Pacific Islands proves costly. A strategy known as leapfrogging enabled the Americans to go on the offensive with limited resources. They would often leapfrog or bypass a heavily defended island and then capture a nearby island that was not well defended. The captured island was then used as an airbase to bomb the Japanese-held island and prevent ships from resupplying it. Cut off from reinforcements and supplies, the Japanese forces would be left to wither. General MacArthur described this leapfrogging approach as, "Hit 'em where they ain't, let 'em die on the vine." Despite the success of leapfrogging, many of the island invasions came at a terrible cost. Thousands of soldiers died in the jungles of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Tarawa, and Saipan. But they kept pushing the Japanese back closer and closer to the home islands. In October 1944, MacArthur made his triumphant return to the Philippines, where his forces would battle the Japanese until the end of the war. In August 1944, the Marines finished retaking the Mariana Islands. The Marianas Campaign was a landmark victory. It gave the Allied Pacific Force secure bases from which long-range B-29s could make strategic bombing raids on Japan. The final push toward Japan brings heavy losses. The Allied push through the Pacific steadily shrank the defensive perimeter that Japan had established around the home islands. That perimeter would all but disappear if the Allies could capture the key islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima's airfields would offer a place for B-29s to land in an emergency. They would also serve as a base for fighter planes, escort bombers over Germany. Control of Okinawa, just 310 miles south of Japan, would give Americans a prime staging area for the invasion of Japan. To meet these threats, Japanese military leaders moved their best army units from Japan and China to defend the 2 strategic islands. On the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima, the defenders dug caves, tunnels, and concrete-lined bunkers. 3 months of Allied bombardment before the February 1945 invasion did little to soften the defense. The month-long Battle of Iwo Jima was among the bloodiest of the war. Nearly all of the 22,000 Japanese troops followed their commander's orders to fight to the death. To win the island, more than 6,800 American troops died. Admiral Nimitz noted that on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. To take the much larger island of Okinawa, the Allies mounted a huge amphibious, or sea-to-land, invasion in April 1945. More than 1,200 Americans and British troops, including 40 aircraft carriers, supported a combined Army-Marine force of 182,000. As on Iwo Jima, the 120,000 troops defending Okinawa strongly resisted the American invaders. The bloody combat at the Battle of Okinawa, much of it hand-to-hand, continued for 2 months. It claimed the lives of some 12,000 American soldiers and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers. Meanwhile, another kind of combat was taking place in the surrounding waters. Earlier in the Pacific War, the Japanese had introduced a new weapon, kamikaze pilots. Hundreds of men flew their bomb-filled planes directly into the vessels of the Allied fleet. Kamikaze attacks sank or damaged hundreds of ships, but they failed to sink any aircraft carriers, which were their main targets. The Manhattan Project develops a top-secret weapon. The stage was now set for an invasion of Japan, but the United States had its scientists working on another option. In 1939, German-American scientist Albert Einstein had written to President Roosevelt explaining that scientists might soon be able to turn uranium into a new form of energy. That energy, he said, could be harnessed to build extremely powerful bombs. Einstein expressed his fear that Germany was already engaged in experiments to create such an atomic bomb. The power of these explosive weapons comes from the energy suddenly released from splitting the nuclei of uranium or plutonium atoms. 3 years after Einstein sent his letter, the government established the Manhattan Project, a top-secret program to develop an atomic weapon. A team of scientists, many of whom had fled fascist nations in Europe, carried on the research and development. Much of the work took place at a lab in Los Alamos, New Mexico. By the summer of 1945, their efforts had produced the first atomic bomb. On July 16th, the test bomb was exploded on a remote air base in the New Mexico desert. Physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer witnessed the blinding flash of light, intense heat, and violent shock wave that the bomb produced. He later said the blast reminded him of a line from the Hindu scripture, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Truman faces a decision to drop the bomb. After the successful test of the atomic bomb, or A-bomb, President Truman had to decide whether to drop the bomb on Japan or to launch an invasion. After Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Truman knew an invasion would produce enormous casualties. The number of allies killed and wounded might reach 500,000, he was told. Truman faced a stubborn enemy. American B-29s were already destroying Japan with conventional bombs, including incendiaries. These firebombs killed hundreds of thousands of people and turned large areas of major Japanese cities, with their masses of wooden buildings, into cinders. At the same time, a naval blockade cut off the supply of raw materials to Japan. The bombing and blockade had left many Japanese starving, and many of the country's leaders realized that Japan could not possibly win the war. Yet the Japanese refused to accept the unconditional surrender Truman demanded. In fact, they seemed ready to fight to the last man, woman, and child, in the spirit of the kamikaze. Oppenheimer and others believed only the shock of an atomic bomb would end the Japanese resistance. Some officials objected to dropping the A-bomb. General Curtis LeMay insisted that his B-29 bombing campaign would soon bring Japan's surrender. General Eisenhower agreed. It was my belief, Eisenhower wrote later, that Japan was, at that very moment, seeking some way to surrender with a minimum loss of face, honor. Others maintained that the Japanese would give up if Truman would agree to let them keep their beloved emperor. The United States bombs Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Truman stuck to his demand for an unconditional surrender. He told Japan that the alternative was prompt and utter destruction. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, a city of 300,000 people. Within seconds of the explosion, up to 80,000 people died. The blast shock wave toppled nearly 60,000 structures, and hundreds of fires consumed the rest of the city. 3 days later, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb. This one obliterated the city of Nagasaki, killing some 40,000 people instantly. As many as 250,000 Japanese may have died from the two atomic bombs, either directly or as a result of burns, radiation poisoning, or cancer. Truman had no regrets. "Let there be no mistake about it," he said later. "I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it would be used." The destruction of Nagasaki brought a Japanese surrender. Truman received this informal surrender on August 14th, Victory over Japan Day, or VJ Day. The terms of the surrender allowed the emperor to keep his office, but only in a ceremonial role. The Allies officially accepted the surrender aboard the American battleship Missouri on Tokyo Bay. Millions celebrated VJ Day, which marked the end of the Second World War, but they also mourned the loss of lives. About 55 million died, 30 million of them civilians. The Soviet Union paid the highest human cost, with more than 20 million of its people killed. Some 400,000 Americans, nearly all in the military, gave their lives. Most Americans believed strongly that these soldiers, sailors, airmen, and others had died for a noble cause.